Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another season preview video here. In today's video, we're looking back at the Pacific Division, looking at another two teams. Today, we're looking at the Calgary Flames and the Edmonton Oilers, the Alberta teams. Look at how these two teams did this past year, the offseason, how they're looking going to 25-26. But to all the updates regarding these two teams coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to the video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this without all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. And don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. So in today's video, another season preview video as per usual. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the Calgary Flames and the Edmonton Oilers. Two of the last teams we're going to be looking at in the Pacific Division. We only got, I think, 4 videos after today left regarding the season preview video. So we're coming close to the end of the season preview series. So as usual, look at how they did in the 2024-2025 season. Look at their additions and subtractions, some major trades that these two teams made. Look at the top 3 draft picks in the 2025 draft for both the Flames and the Oilers. Then we'll look at my offseason preview checklist, and then we'll look at my lineups, my projected point total, and my offseason grades for these two teams. So we'll start with the Calgary Flames last year. Not an overly great season. They almost made the playoffs. They're one of a couple of teams who were in the hunt for a playoff spot. They actually tied the St. Louis Blues for the final playoff spot in the Western Conference, but because of tiebreakers, they missed. They wound up finishing with a record of 41-27-14 with 96 points, 4th in the Pacific Division, 9th in the Western Conference, and 15th in the entire NHL. Had they been in the Eastern Conference, they would have made the playoffs. But unfortunately, they were in the Western Conference, where it was a little bit harder to make the playoffs, and even though they did get a really good point total, hitting 40+ wins and 90+ points, it was not enough to push them into a playoff spot. So of interest note there, they had 220 goals for and 236 goals against, so it's not one of the worst we've seen in the entire NHL. Like Montreal made the playoffs with a -18, so a -16 isn't overly bad, but you usually want to be in the plus section of the plus-minus category if you want to make the playoffs. Flames did not do that last year, so that's really a little bit of a sour point on last year's season. When you go over to their goal and point scoring leaders, Kadri led the team with 67 points, followed by Huberdeau, who had 62, and Weegar, who had 47. Kadri led the team with 35 goals, followed by Huberdeau, who had 28, and Coronado, who had 24. So Coronado was a pleasant surprise last year, really started to come into his own, especially later on in the season. Well, Weegar, Huberdeau, and Zary, the 3 big pieces they got, not last offseason, but a couple of off seasons ago, were the team's point leaders, and Kadri and Huberdeau were the team's goal scoring leaders. So of interest note there, but they only had 2 players at 60+ points. No one hit 70+ points, and only 1 player in Kadri hit 30+ goals. So you can see why they were one of the worst teams when it comes to the goal scoring side. So very interesting note there. And once again, they missed the playoffs, so there's no playoff stats to go off of for the Flames. Next, going over to their offseason additions and subtractions. Not a long list here. They added Nick Cicek and Ivan Prosvetov, who were both playing overseas last year, and they lost Anthony Mantha to Pittsburgh, Kevin Rooney to New Jersey on a PTO, Martin Frk to UFA status, Tyson Barrie, who's retired, Jared Tenori to UFA status, and Dan Vladar to Philadelphia. So once again, not very much movement from the Calgary Flames. Like, they add Cicek, who's going to help them a tiny bit on the blue line, but they do lose Barrie and Tenori. Barrie was a decent third-pair defenseman last year. Tenori, sort of like a call-up option, so they don't really lose a whole bunch on the blue line, but they don't really get a whole bunch either. They still have Prosvetov for Vladar. Prosvetov has had flashes during his time in the NHL to be a decent backup, so we will be seeing this upcoming season if he's able to do that, but I definitely think he's not as good at his current point in time as Vladar. And they lose Mantha, Rooney, and Frk from the free agent market on their forward group. Mantha didn't play a whole bunch last year because of injuries. Rooney was a call-up option, 4th-line guy. Frk was an AHL level guy. So they don't lose a whole bunch of talent, but they do lose a little bit of depth, especially on the forward group, and they don't really add a whole bunch either. So a very interesting offseason from the Flames. They didn't make any trades this offseason, so there's no trades to talk about when it comes to Calgary. Next, going over to our top 3 draft picks from the 2025 draft. So they had 3 draft picks, all in the top 55 of this year's draft. They had 2 first-round picks, one was 18th, one was 32nd. They took center prospects with both of them. At 18th overall, they took Cole Reshcheny, and at 32nd overall, they took Cullen Potter, 2 guys who I think eventually could challenge for like 2nd, 3rd line center roles at the NHL NHL level. And then the second round, 54th overall, they took another center prospect, and that's Stockselius, who I think eventually could also challenge for like a third line center, maybe second line center role. So very interesting note there. But the Flames really did identify the center position as something they were going to target in the draft, and their top 3 draft picks were all center prospects. So very interesting note there. But some very interesting pickups here in the draft from the Calgary Flames. Next, going over to the 5 things I said in the offseason preview this team should do in the offseason to get better. So as per usual, I mentioned 5 things in my offseason preview that this team should do in the offseason. The first thing I said this team should do was to move one of or multiple of Yoel Farabee, Mikael Backlund, Blake Coleman. They didn't move any of them. Coleman's still signed for a couple more seasons and is on the Calgary Flames team. Farabee's still signed for a couple more seasons and is on the Calgary Flames team. And Mikael Backlund, who was entering the final year of his contract, got extended. So none of those 3 guys got moved. They're all still on the Flames. So that's a big X on my checklist because they did not complete that priority in my opinion. The second thing I said this team to do was to either re-sign Vladar or add a new backup. I guess to some extent you could say that. Like Prosvetov, I just think at this point in time probably has the inside track to be the backup to Dustin Wolf. He's definitely not going to be as good of a backup goaltender as Dan Vladar was last year to Dustin Wolf. I don't think it's a big improvement on what Vladar was last year, so I don't think it really improved, but they did technically get a guy who can really replace Vladar as the backup. So I guess to some extent you could say they completed that off the checklist. The third thing that this team should do was to add top 4 defensemen. Didn't do that. Their biggest defensive addition was Nick Cicek, who at best can be a call-up option, maybe a 6 to 7 defenseman. So didn't add any sort of top 4 defensive upgrades, which was something I was hoping this team was definitely going to do this offseason. So that's another X. The fourth thing I said this team should do was to use some of their draft capital to add some younger players on their forward group or their defensive end. Like they had a lot of draft capital, including 2 first-round picks. So I was hoping they would move some of it to acquire some younger pieces. Didn't do that either. Like they kept basically all of their picks. They made, I think, 1 draft day swap. So they really didn't use any of their draft capital to add young current NHL players. And that's another X on my checklist. And the fifth thing I said this team should do was to add top 6 goal scorer. And once again, didn't complete it. They did not make one singular addition on the forward group this past offseason. So while they did keep a couple of guys with their team, they did not add anyone on the forward group, especially in the top 6. So that's why that is another X for the Calgary Flames on my offseason checklist. So very interesting note there. But the Flames didn't complete 4 of my 5 things. And to some extent, I guess you could say they didn't even complete the 5th on my offseason checklist. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my projected lineup for the Calgary Flames for 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, my projected lineup for the Flames is as follows. On the top line, I have Huberdeau with Zary and Pospisil. Second unit is Sharangovich with Kadri and Coronado. The third unit is Coleman with Frost and Farabee. And the fourth unit is Lomberg with Backlund and Klapka. D pair 1 is Bala with Anderson. D pair 2 is Perek with Uyghur. And D pair 3 is Bean with Miromanov. Wolf is the starter. Prosvetov is the backup. And Kirkland, Hanley, and Pakel are the 3 spares. And that would be a decent roster. Like defensive-wise, it's rough. It's not very great backup-wise on the goaltending side. And up front, like it's a decently deep roster, but it's not one of the deepest we've seen in recent memory. So very interesting note there. That's my projected lineup for the Calgary Flames. Next, going over to my projected point total for the Flames for the upcoming season. So at this current point in time, I have the Flames taking a tiny step back. I don't think they're going to do as good as they were last year. They lost a little bit of depth. Last year, like completely surprised. I thought they were going to do awful last year. Instead, they wound up staying with the system and they wound up doing a lot better, almost making the playoffs. I don't think they're going to get that lucky again this year. At this current point in time, I have them finishing with a record of 36, 33, and 13 for 85 points, which is really 12th in the Western Conference. So I think they're going to take a little bit of a step back. I could see them maybe challenge for a playoff spot, but I think it's highly unlikely they're going to make the playoffs at this point. I have them having an 11-point drop-off. I think Wolf's probably going to have a sophomore slump of some kind. I think there's a really good chance some of the other players don't have as good seasons as they did last year. And while I don't think they're going to be one of the worst teams in the NHL, I do think they're going to take enough of a step back. Then they're going to be a lot closer to 500 than they were last year. So that's my opinion on the Calgary Flames and where I see them seeing as it's right now. Currently have them being 12th in the Western Conference with 85 points. And last year, going over to my off-season grade. So if you look at this Calgary Flames team, look at what they did this off-season. They didn't do much. So they added a depth defenseman and a backup goaltender, and they lost lost a better backup goaltender, some depth on the blue line, and some depth on the forward group. So like they didn't really add anything. They didn't really lose a whole bunch of solid pieces. So I'm going to give them a D-. I definitely would have liked to see him add a whole bunch more things, especially someone on the blue line, maybe even a guy on the forward group, but they didn't really do any of that. So that's why I'm giving them a D- on my offseason grade, and I think it's warranted for what sort of offseason they just went through. So very interesting note there. And next, going over to the Edmonton Oilers. So going over to the Edmonton Oilers, they had a pretty good season last year. They finished with a record of 48, 29, and 5 for 101 points. It was good enough for 3rd in the Pacific Division, 6th in the Western Conference, and 9th in the entire NHL. So they were a team who was able to hit the triple-digit point mark, which is very good stuff there. However, it did come with them being 3rd in the Pacific Division. So for the first time in a while, they had to start the playoffs being the road team, but that was very interesting note there, and they were able to make the playoffs again. They wound up having 259 goals for, 235 goals against, so they were a plus 24 last year. So nowhere close to teams like Vegas and Tampa with how absolutely dominant those two teams were in the plus-minus category, but they were well into the plus category of the plus-minus stuff. So very interesting note there, but it was a solid plus-minus stat for the Edmonton Oilers. Point and goal scoring leaders in the regular season. Draisaitl led the team with 106 points, followed by McDavid who had 100, and Bouchard who had 67. Draisaitl led the team with 52 goals, followed by Hyman who had 27, and McDavid who had 26. So very interesting note there. Draisaitl, once again, point driver, had a really solid season there for the Edmonton Oilers. McDavid had a pretty good season too, hitting triple digits again. Bouchard had 67 points, and even though it was a far cry from his 50-goal season the year prior, Hyman still had a pretty solid season. So very interesting note there. This team made the playoffs, the 3rd team in the Pacific Division. They wound up, even though they lost the first 2 games, being the LA Kings in 6 games in round 1. They'll follow that up with a win over the Pacific Winning Knights in round 2 in 5 games. Then they beat the Dallas Stars, who were 2nd in the Central Division, in round 3 in 5 games. And then they fell at the hands of the Florida Panthers in 6 games in the Stanley Cup Final for the 2nd straight year. So it was heartbreaking, the Cup Final again for the Oilers as they fell at the hands of the Florida Panthers. So very interesting note there. Draisaitl led the team with 33 points. McDavid also had 33 points in the postseason. And then Draisaitl led the team with 11 goals, followed by Corey Perry, who had 10 goals for the Edmonton Oilers in the postseason. So very interesting note there. Perry had a really solid postseason run for the Edmonton Oilers. And then Draisaitl and McDavid were both really good once again. So very interesting note there. But those are all the stats for the Edmonton Oilers from this past offseason. Next, going over to the offseason additions and subtractions with the Edmonton Oilers. So it's a very interesting list here. They add Howard and Mangiapane from Washington, Isaac Howard from Tampa in a trade, Curtis Lazar from New Jersey, Riley Stillman from Carolina, Matt Tompkins from Tampa, as well as the 2025 4th rounder, which was Ottawa's, and 2027 5th rounder, which was Boston's, in trades. Meanwhile, they lose Corey Perry to Los Angeles in free agency, Samuel Riley to Tampa in a trade, Perreault as a UFA, Skinner to San Jose, both in free agency. They lose Kane to Vancouver in a trade, Arvidsson to Boston in a trade. They lose Connor Brown to New Jersey, Derek Ryan to retirement, Lane Pearson to Philly, John Klingberg to San Jose, Travis Dermott, who's a UFA, Colin Delia, who's a UFA, and Oliver Rodrigue to overseas. And those were all via free agency. So very interesting note there. Like if you look at this team, goaltending wise, they add Tompkins to be a new 3rd stringer. Well, they lose Delia and Rodrigue, who were basically the AHL goaltenders last year, so a little bit of swap on the AHL goaltending side. They wound up losing Dermott and Klingberg on the defensive side, but they do add a guy like Riley Stillman, who should be able to fill in as like a depth defenseman. The loss of Klingberg will probably hurt to some extent for Edmonton next year, but still, it's not an overly bad problem on the defensive end. However, on the forward group, they lose a lot of depth and a lot of solid players. They lose depth players like Lane Peterson, Derek Ryan, as well as Jacob Perreault and Sam O'Reilly, or other was a prospect. They add Mangiapane, who should be a solid top 6 forward, Isaac Howard, who should be a solid top 9 forward, and Curtis Lazar, who can be a solid, very versatile 4th line guy. So they do add some on the forward group, but they lose Corey Perry, Jeff Skinner, Evander Kane, Victor Arvidsson, and Connor Brown. Those were 4 or 5 regulars in their NHL lineup, because some of them were sometimes a healthy scratch. But like Connor Brown, consistent top 9 forward, Skinner, Arvidsson, sometimes top 9 forward, sometimes healthy scratches, Perry, really solid playoff run, and Evander Kane, while he didn't play at all in the regular season last year, was a little bit of a factor in the postseason too. So they lose a lot of forward depth. Like I know they add Mangiapane and Howard, which are going to be really solid top 9 additions, but losing Perry, Skinner, Kane, as well as Arvidsson, Arvidsson and Brown to replace the production with just Mangiapane and Howard. It's not overly good, so they definitely lose a lot of solid forwards as well as forward depth for the Edmonton Oilers in the offseason, so very interesting note there. Team made 3 trades this offseason, acquiring Isaac Howard from Tampa in exchange for Sam O'Reilly, acquiring a 2025 4th rounder Ottawa's from Vancouver in exchange for Evander Kane, and acquiring a 2027 5th rounder Boston's from the Boston Bruins in exchange for Victor Arvidsson. So 3 very interesting trades, 2 of them captums for the Edmonton Oilers, so very interesting note there. Next, going over to their top 3 draft picks from the 2025 draft. So if you look at this team, the first pick they had in the 2025 draft was 83rd overall. In the 3rd round, they took center prospect Lafreniere, who we think eventually could be a solid 3rd, 4th line center for the Oilers. 4th round, 117th overall, they took left winger Lewandowski, who I think eventually could be a solid bottom 6 guy. And 5th rounder, 131st overall, they took left shot defenseman Barnett, who I think eventually could maybe challenge like a 3rd pair role. So they didn't have a whole bunch of draft capital, just a couple of lower end picks, but I think they took a couple of decent prospects with those picks, so very interesting note there. Next, going over to the 5 things I said this team should do in the offseason to get better and improve for its upcoming season. Now, the first thing I said this team should do was to move Skinner and Picard and add a solid starter. They didn't do that. Skinner and Picard are currently, at this current point, the 2 goalies who are still on the roster for the Edmonton Oilers. Now, maybe closer to trade deadline, they do make that sort of a swap, but at this current point in time, they still have Skinner and Picard on their roster, so that's an X on my checklist. The second thing I said this team should do is to extend Evan Bouchard before he got a chance to be offer sheeted. They did that, signed to a 4-year deal, double-digit $1 million AAV extension, with him having a $10.5 million AAV now. So it's a pretty pricey deal, but Bouchard was able to get extended before free agency hits, thus negating an offer sheet opportunity, and thus keeping him in Edmonton, so that's a check off my checklist. The third thing I said this team should do is to get McDavid a contract extension. I was saying this to, at the very least, at some point in August or September, to get something done. At this current point in time, as I record this video, a McDavid extension has not materialized yet, and there are even some people out there saying maybe there's a slim possibility he could leave Edmonton. So we'll have to wait and see on that, but at this current point in time, a McDavid extension has not happened. That's a big X on my checklist. The fourth thing it says you should do is to move one of or multiple of Arvidsson, Kane, or Henrique. They did that completely. Arvidsson and Kane were both dealt as cap dumps to Vancouver and Boston. Henrique, because there's no movement clause, is still with the Edmonton Oilers, but they also lost Perry and Brown via free agency, so they did get off of some of their bad contracts, which I think was a really good thing for them to do, which was a check on my checklist. And the fifth thing I said you should do was to rework the bottom 6. They did to some extent. They add Curtis Lazar, but they lose guys like Perry and Brown, so I guess to some extent they did rework the bottom 6. They're going to have a couple of younger players in the bottom 6 this upcoming season, but they didn't really add a whole bunch, so I say to some extent they did that, so I'm going to give them a check mark for that. So very interesting note there, but those were 5 things that this team need to do in the offseason to get better, and they did a couple of them, but I think the biggest one was to not, at this point in time, have McDavid under contract beyond next year. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my projected lineup for the Edmonton Oilers for 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, my projected lineup for the Edmonton Oilers is as follows. The top unit would be Draisaitl with McDavid and Mangiapane. The second unit would be Hyman with Nugent Hopkins and Howard. The third unit would be Podkolzin with Savoy and Frederick. And the fourth unit would be Henrique with Lazar and Kapanen. I have Ekholm and Bouchard being pair 1, Nurse and Stretcher being pair 2, and Kulak and Lomond being pair 3. Skinner would be a starter, Picard would be a backup, Janmark, Jones, and Emberson would be the 3 spares. And that would be a decent roster. It's not the deepest of defensive cores. Like I said in the past, that goaltending core is not the greatest in the NHL. However, they do have a pretty deep forward group, even though they did lose a whole bunch of players. It's not the deepest in the NHL anymore, but it is still a pretty deep one, so very interesting note there. Next, going over to my predictions for the Edmonton Oilers for this upcoming 2025-2026 season. So that's current point in time, I've been doing right around the same as they did last year. I think even though they did lose a little bit on the forward group, I do think that they're going to be all in all still a really good team, even though I don't think Skinner and Picard are the goaltending duo to get them far in the playoffs. I think they're still going to have a solid season in the regular season. I had them finishing with a record of 48, 28, and 6 for second in the Pacific Division with 102 points. So it's not the best of seasons for the Edmonton Oilers. I think they're probably going to go a little bit higher in the Pacific Division, once again be a top 13 in the Pacific, once again hit the triple digit mark, be a point higher than last year, so it's not much of a change from last year. So I still think they're going to have a really solid season. They're still going to make the playoffs, but I just just think they didn't have an overly great offseason. So very interesting note there. And that's going to my offseason grade. So at this current point in time, my offseason grade for the Edmonton Oilers is a D rating. I know they add Howard, they add Mangiapane, they add a little bit of depth from draft capital, but with the amount of forward power they lost on the forward group, especially the depth, and also a couple of guys they lost on the blue line and on the goaltending side, I just think they didn't really improve a whole bunch. If anything, they got a little bit worse. I still think they're going to have a really solid season, be second in the Pacific, hit 102 points. I just don't think they had an overly great offseason. So that's why I'm giving them a D rating. I think it's warranted for the offseason they just had. So very interesting note there. But that's my opinion on the Edmonton Oilers and the Calgary Flames. I left you guys' thoughts. Do you think the Flames are poised to take a step back? Definitely miss the playoffs. Do you think the Oilers will probably hit right around the same amount as they did last year? And I left you guys' thoughts on all the other things that we discussed here in this video regarding the Flames and the Oilers for the offseason and the predictions for next year. Definitely your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk for today or until this video. And if you'd like to subscribe below, thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this without all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming in the very near future. Also a blog, talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So check that out. I'll link that down in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.